question, but I will get this started because it's 12:04, and what we'd like to do are these nice little bits of classics to keep us going and to make our lives richer on a Saturday afternoon, and then we can go off and do our other things. I'm sure everyone has got lots of other stuff to do as well. In fact, our author today, our speaker today, Harry Eyres, is someone who knows a bit about slowing down, maybe, and so maybe we can learn a thing or two about him on that topic. He's the author of a column in the Financial Times of London called The Slow Lane, and about just the various forms that we can be more appreciative of culture and food and poetry, art, all kinds of things. And Harry is a freelance journalist who has written on many topics. I mean, I was just looking, if you look up the name Harry Eyres, you'll find all sorts of writing on really just a broad range of things. I was just, this is you, Harry, about Jose Ortega y Gasset. Yeah, you know, I mean, like all kinds of things, and politics, and in particular wine. He is an expert on wine, an author of several books on wine, and an amateur classicist, which is something that is particularly dear to us at the Paideia Institute. And he is the author of this book, which I recommend to you all, Horace and Me, Life Lessons from an Ancient Poet. I recently read it. I wrote a review of it for In Medias Res, and I was really impressed. I feel this is the kind of thing that I would love to see more of. People really honestly, from their own lives, reading with depth and reacting to great classical literature. And we've got a chance to listen to Harry talk about this book and about wine and about the relationship between the poet Horace and wine. And I am very much looking forward to it. So so join me in giving a warm welcome, maybe just like, yeah, I don't know, they've got a little like a little button you can hit for clap in there too. But anyway, but for Harry Eyres. So we'll have a lecture, and then there'll be questions afterwards. All right, and I will moderate the taking of the questions once Mr. Eyres is done. So Harry, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction, and also for your very kind words in your review, where you actually seem to really get to the heart of what I was trying to do in Horace and Me, which I'm not sure everyone has done. And in particular, well, perhaps we'll come on to wine. That's obviously something that resonated with you too. But the life lessons bit also, you were wise enough to see that this could have been a little bit of a publisher's subtitle, in that I'm not actually telling people how to live. But I think going back to Horace, as I found that I was doing in my 40s, was actually one of the best ways you could possibly do that, but in obviously rather an oblique way. Yeah, I mean, I had to come back to Horace because I didn't really take to him that much when I was a schoolboy, which is when I came across him, because I was studying Latin and Greek, and you know, like others, including I've just been talking to John actually, and his middle name alludes to the poet Byron, and Byron didn't really like Horace very much. He said, "Farewell, Horace, whom I hated so, not for my faults, not for thy faults, but mine. It is a curse to understand, not feel thy lyric flow, to comprehend, but never love thy verse." So that was Byron. And I think this, speaking for quite a lot of romantics who sort of didn't really take to Horace because he wasn't exactly a romantic, unlike Catullus, who I found much more accessible as a teenager. I think probably a lot of us do, because he spoke about love in a very direct, unmistakably direct sort of way. And Horace is not like that. And I struggled with Horace, and he's quite difficult. I expect a lot of you know that. I mean, he really isn't an easy author in any way at all, and it's often difficult to construe, and it's difficult to understand. Not always, but I think really he is quite a difficult poet. Although he's also in a way, very affable, friendly poet. But he's difficult because he was exceptionally bright, I think. I've come to think more and more the older I've got. But I did find a way into Horace, that something that actually did resonate with me, that struck a chord with me as a teenager when I was studying Odes Book 1, and that was wine. And that's why wine is the kind of subject of this talk, or Horace and Wine, or Horace and Why Wine Matters. Well, I immediately picked up that wine was something very important for Horace. It seemed to me obvious, but funnily enough, not obvious to everyone, I think, who has read Horace or written about Horace. There was a reason probably why this was an obvious sort of way in for me, because I was the son of a wine merchant. My father was a wine merchant. That is to say, an independent wine merchant who ran his business from home. And our home was a rather lovely house that was full of wine, particularly the cellar at the bottom of the house. But actually, there was wine everywhere. And there was bits of paraphernalia connected with wine, because my father was passionate about it. My mother was always complaining about the amount of wine stuff there was in the house, trying to clear it out. I loved it. I loved the smells. I loved the feel of it, and then the poetry and the romance of it, which I seemed to kind of pick up quite quickly, because it was actually something my father felt very deeply. He was a very cultured man, and wine for him was part of culture, very obviously. And I never had any doubt about that. He was also passionate about classical music, and it was the same kind of thing as far as I could see. You appreciated it carefully, you talked about it, you discussed it. Of course, it had a slight difference because you drank it, and then that might have some effect on your mental state, hopefully positive on the whole. So I was well disposed towards anything to do with wine, and I realized that Horace, was always talking about wine in the Odes. I'm talking about, not so much, I have to say, in the satires and the epistles, but in the Odes. Time and time again, he talks about wine. And I just wasn't having any of this, it's just a literary convention thing, which I found extremely irritating, I have to say. Perhaps somebody would like to ask a question about that later. But this thing that, that's just a literary topic, or that's something that the ancient Greek poets talk about. So as if that's like an explanation for why Horace is talking about wine. Well, yes, there is a tradition of drinking songs and so on. And definitely he was very aware of that, but clearly he was also very personally engaged in the whole subject of wine, it seemed to me. I did find I had a sort of connection with him, but it sort of languished for quite a long time, for many years, actually, probably for decades. And funnily enough, well, I was not the only person this happened to, and there's the great quote which John referred to in his review, actually, from Rudyard Kipling, about how his classics teacher taught him to, John will probably remember, I haven't got it in front of me, but it's something like to hate Horace for 2 years, and then to forget him for, I think, 20, and then to love him more and more, which is an extraordinary idea. I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense, does it, that you would actually hate a poet, and then you would forget them, and then you would come to love them. It's an extraordinary sort of trajectory, but that's how it was for Kipling. It wasn't quite like that for me. I didn't entirely hate him, but anyway, there was a similar thing that I think Horace is a poet for the middle-aged, I have to say, difficult for the young. And we can talk about that more, perhaps it'll come up more. But anyway, I found myself coming back to Horace in my 40s, and actually particularly in the form of translation. And you'll see that this is something I do. I translate Latin poetry in a very free way, which is admittedly, sometimes I take liberties, perhaps I take too many liberties, up to you to whatever you think. But I found I was coming back to Horace because I wanted to translate 1 or 2 odes, and that led to then a much deeper reconsideration of him, thinking about him and realizing how incredibly interesting he was, actually, and I thought relevant to our times. Well, this is more than 10 years ago, but our times haven't changed that much. But he seemed to be very relevant, yes, also, which is maybe something we won't be able to talk about too much today. But In any case, I was talking about wine, and I think wine is a good place to start. And as John very astutely sort of pointed out in his review, and wine really is a sort of master symbol, I think, of Horace's poetry. It's something that, it's a bit like a magnet. It sort of gathers together all these fragments, all these different things, and it draws them together into something rather wonderful, which keeps on, being revisited and re-expressed in different ways in different poems. So what was wine to Horace? Obviously, this is 2,000 odd years ago. Well, wine was still already then a hugely important economic reality, in Italy, and as it is today, and that's maybe it was even more important in terms of the number of people involved in wine production and everything. I couldn't give you the figures of that. Maybe there are some economic historians who could say more about that, but wine was immensely important in that way. It was a fact of life. It was a daily pleasure and delight, and comfort and sustenance for an enormous number of people in Italy, in Rome, and throughout the empire, and slaves as well as free men, and had their portions of wine. Those of you, I'm sure many of you have been to Pompeii, and you no doubt will have gone around or been shown the various wine vials. In my book, I said there are 118. So I don't know where I got that figure from, but it seemed quite an impressive number. Anyway, so but that was a bit later, of course. So wine was a fact of life, very basic in a way. I think it's important that wine is something quite basic as well as something sort of transcendent in Horace, which again, John saw that or pointed that out. So yeah, and wine growing, viticulture had been introduced to Italy by the Greek colonists who colonized the southern part of Italy. Horace, it's very important always to remember, I think, that Horace was a southerner. He came from a place called Venusia, modern-day Venosa, now in Basilicata, about 2 hours from Naples. A lovely little place. I strongly recommend a visit if anyone is ever in the area. It's very quiet and low-key, but very nice, very pretty town. It was a big military center at that point, actually. So maybe it was actually a bit much busier than it is today. That's where Horace grew up. And interestingly enough, Venosa is now the center of production of a wine I rather like called Aglianico del Vulture, which is a fiery, minerally red wine made from the Aglianico grape. And I like to think this might have some connection with Horace, although it's, who knows whether this grape is an old Italian grape, definitely, but I can't say all that more. But it comes, the mountain Vulture is mentioned by Horace, particularly in the great poem Odes, book 3, number 4, when he wandered on this mountain, which is very visible from Venosa. And according to him, he was fell asleep and he was protected by a blanket of leaves, woven by doves, which is protected from wolves and bears. It's an extraordinary image. Who knows what the reality was? But so it's all very real for Horace. Wine on one level, it's connected to the earth, to place, which is hugely important, and it's important in wine. All nowadays, talk about wine is all about place, terroir. The French word terroir is now used, constantly, which means the place and the sort of microclimate and everything around the place. But Horace was a very, very sensitive to place, I think, and particular places. And so wine comes from a place, always, or decent wine. I mean, mass-produced wine could come from many different places all at once and put into an enormous tank or vat. That's not so interesting, but interesting wine comes from particular places. So it's about place, and it's about the earth. It comes from the earth. It's a basic product of the earth, as we also come from the earth. We're earthlings. This is important. Well, what else? There are several other things on my list. I'm afraid this could be too long a list, but there we are. Wine is also a topic of conversation, I would say. It's something that kind of civilized, educated Romans would talk about in the same way that maybe people in New York and London and Rome also nowadays talk about wine. Some people would say, they could verge on wine sort of geekery, wine snobbery, and the Romans were definitely getting into that. That they were interested in wine, I think, and something you talked about. So when Horace is addressing particularly Maecenas, his patron, a very civilized and also sort of aristocratic, wealthy man, he talks about wine as a knowledgeable person, particular wines, the top wines. But not only the top wines, as we'll see in a minute. What else? Well, wine, I think, is very, very deeply connected with friendship for Horace, and I must say, for me, I think it's a lubricator of friendship. It's a facilitator of friendship, and friendship is, I think, arguably the most important topic of all for Horace. I can't think of a more important one. I think this idea of friendship, being an amicus and amicitia is certainly more important than romantic love, which Horace isn't particularly hot on, as you probably noticed. And I'm not going to talk about that in this talk, although it is quite interesting. And I don't think it's entirely absent, but it's friendship for him, I think, he's come to think that friendship is something probably better than romantic love, which is actually quite sort of interesting in our time. It's in a way quite sort of challenging, and of course his particular friendships. I mean, his friendship with Maecenas, his patron, is very, very central to Horace's life and poetry, as I'm sure you all know. We'll come on to that. But not only with Maecenas, there are many other friends mentioned in his poetry. Apologies if I sound a bit throaty. I've had a horrible cold. I do apologize. But, well, this will come into when I talk about the first of the three poems, that three odes I want to discuss in a minute. So friendship, nothing more important than that, really. And wine is really, really important in relation to friendship. It's also, as we all know, it's something that may loosen inhibitions, may mellow your mood. Perhaps I should say that first. Perhaps the mood mellowing comes first, then the loosening of inhibitions. This we'll talk about that a bit more in relation to the second of the three poems I'm going to talk about. Well, also, this may sound a bit strange, but I would say it is also connected to philosophy, which is another very, very important subject for Horace. I mean, it may, in perhaps the latter part of his life, philosophy, was almost as important as friendship, I would say. I mean, his later poems are very philosophical, as I'm sure you know. But wine, arguably, well, it seems to me, this could be not something you all agree with, but it can be a sort of aid to philosophy. It can help us to think. Now, that's not what most people might say, because you might think if you have too much wine, you can't think at all, and you become eventually completely incapable of thinking. But if you have the right amount, possibly your thinking may sort of flow or move in a rather creative sort of way. Now, that's an interesting subject for me, which I've written about elsewhere, but actually a philosopher who strongly believed that, not a very controversial philosopher, Heidegger, but Heidegger strongly believed in the helpful power of wine in relation to thinking. Anyway, we could leave that to one side for now. Well, we haven't reached the end of the list, I'm afraid. There's still a few more items. Wine is also connected to poetic inspiration. That's very important, and we'll talk about that in connection with the third of the three odes. And perhaps poetry more generally. I thought my last item on my list might be this one, that wine was a conduit to the divine, which we'll see in a little while, but which I think Horace, at his most exalted, he did feel that whatever he believed, which I think he believed different things at different times possibly, but he does talk about gods quite a lot, and there's a sort of feeling of the divine which comes into things at the end of the second of the Odes I'm going to talk about, and indeed throughout the third of them. We are in the sort of realm of the divine. But having thought that was the last item on my list, I realized that maybe the most important thing about wine in relation to Horace is actually not even that. It's something to do with human essence. The fact that wine, almost uniquely among sort of artifacts, ages in the same kind of way that human beings do. It ages and matures. That's, I think, very, very fascinating, that a wine can live roughly the same length of time as a human being. And indeed, in the second of these poems, Horace addresses this ode to a jar of wine that was vintage in the same year that he was born, which is very interesting, I think. So it must have been about 40 years old, which is quite old. But wine has that characteristic that it ages and it matures. Of course, it also gets too old at some point. Well, I'm afraid that may happen to us too. There's something very, very human about it. So it's a great symbol of the human, I think. By the way, I didn't add, I suppose, when I said Lucian's inhibitions and so on, perhaps I should have mentioned the most famous of all his poems, which has the famous, the great two-line motto, the two-word motto, carpe diem, because that also is a wine poem. And you may say it's a seduction poem, but it's about how wine might help you to live in the moment. So anyway, gosh, that was a long list, wasn't it? So now in the rest of what's left of the talk before the questions, I just wanted to look at these three odes. The first one being Odes 120, which in Latin begins vile or vile potabis. You probably, I'm sure you all know this. This is apparently very short. It's only 3 stanzas long, three quatrains. It appears to be rather slight, but in fact, it's not at all, in my view. It's typical of Horace that he packs so much into this short poem. It's an incredible poem, I think. But it's addressed, of course, to Maecenas, and it's very much about his friendship with Maecenas, but much more than that. But it is also about wine. It starts with wine. So I'll just give you my very free translation with excuses that it's not as accurate as you might hope. Just the basic plonk in standard tumblers. The local Sabine wine is what you'll get from me, Maecenas, but my own, a jar of home brew I laid up and sealed the day, my friend, you had your triumph, when the applause was thunderous, grateful Romans acknowledging what you'd done, the happy echo ringing round 7 hills. Then you drank the best Brunello, without doubt. But as I say, you'll get no Grand Crus here, just what I grow in my own shady valley, here in the corner that you blessed me with. I do take 1 or 2 liberties in this poem, but in my translation, but I hope that the essence of it may come through. And well, he's saying to Maecenas, you're going to get this very basic plonk, this Sabine wine, vile Sabinum. Vile is, I think, first meaning in the dictionary I have is cheap. So he really is saying, this is nothing special you're going to get here. And but of course, it's very deceptive, because he's also very proud of this wine, and he himself has seen to its fermentation and sealed it with pitch in a Greek jar. He's very proud of it, and to me, the 2 most important words in the whole poem are ego ipse. He's saying, I myself, and but by the way, this may amuse you. This is a slight digression. I tend to go off on very long digressions in my talks, but I haven't got time for that today. But I was rereading this poem for this lecture, and I suddenly realized I could not parse one word, Levi. And I thought, goodness, I don't know, what is that word? You know, because I sort of skipped over it, and I thought it had to do with levo, levari, you know, but it obviously didn't, because that wouldn't be the past tense of levo, will be levavi. And then I was really very, very, very obsessed about this, and I could not think what was this strange past tense, and what it was obviously an irregular verb. And then I contacted a very old friend from school, actually, who did classics with me. I said, "What is it, George? You can tell me this." And he solved the problem anyway. That it is actually the past tense of lino. You know, Levi is the past tense of lino, and it meant sealed with pitch, which is and actually solved the whole problem. So that was rather nice.
It's a cruel one. None of the students get that. That's like, you know.
Well, I mean, it's really
Levis
difficult.
or Levis.
So how would you get from Levi to lino?
No, impossible.
Well, but, with a friend, I solved it anyway. But you know, so there's this pride that he has in this local wine that he produces. At the same time, he's offering it to Maecenas, who's very grand, his friend, also his patron. It's a jar, it's some wine that he sealed on the day when Maecenas had this triumph, which was also a celebration of his recovery from a serious illness, we're told. There's an awful lot going on in this poem, actually. And then at the end of the poem, he comes back to a series of wines which Maecenas is not going to get from Horace, these grand wines. But actually, Horace is pretty proud of the fact that Maecenas is not going to get the grand wines. He's going to get the local wine. And I love that. I think it's so subtle that there's so much going on in this little poem. And it's all done through wine, and I don't know how many other poets have ever done that or could do that, actually. So a beautiful poem, which I find every time I read it, I get more out of it, which is, I suppose, one of the things about Horace. I expect you will all experience that, but there's just so much going on there. One of the things I got actually this time was the Greek jar, Graika Testa, and I was thinking he's also talking about his poetry here, because he's writing in Latin, local, but he's also writing in Greek meters, in this case, actually Sapphics. So he's put the local Latin into a Greek jar, and that's just one of the things. Anyway, that was just something else that came up for me. So that's that one. There's only 12 lines long. The next one is longer. It's Odes 3:21. And this is a poem which is actually addressed to a wine jar. Possibly you all know it. I'll read you my very free version in a second. I think, by the way, the fact it's addressed to a wine jar may have put some people off, or made them think, oh, it can't be a serious poem. How could you address a serious poem to a wine jar? Well, maybe I don't need to say any more after what I've already said. I think it is a serious poem. This is O Nata Mecum, Odes 3:21. Your time is up, my faithful aged Margot, contemporary, my twin. Just think of it, you were vintaged the year of Supermax, shameless spin, that you've never had it so good, Guff. Oh, come, descend. Old friend Jim has called for smoother stuff. Heaven knows what havoc or ferment, what vehement argument or crazy love obsession, or merciful slumping into snores you have in store. Though philosophically inclined and aptest to peruse abstruser tomes by Plato, I know my friend will not refuse a little tipple of the warming kind, not scorned by stern old Cato. In vino veritas, they say. You, venerable vintage, have the subtle knack of mellowing tough nuts. Such a dusty bottle can unlock from the most crusty the best kept secret and release the crack. And that's not all. You can restore to a desperate mind the balm of hope, give strength and sustenance to the poor man faced with all the aftermath of war. One wee dram, and he'll feel potent as a pope. Your presence brings diviner traces, goat-like Bacchus and the gorgeous Venus, if she's willing, and the gang of graces, so slow to untie their virgins' girdles, all dance around us while we drink till dawn. Now, and there's so much to say about this poem, and I realize time is slightly running out, but where do you start? And I think Horace has sort of summed up everything he feels about wine in this poem. And you know, it's addressed to a wine jar, as I've said, a jar of wine vintage the same year he was born. And the references in my translation may be a bit obscure to a non-English audience, because Super Mac is our Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who was famous for saying, "You've never had it so good." And that's referring to the year of my birth. So that's why. And I said Margot as an example of a great wine. Of course, that's not. It's actually Masic, one of the great Italian wines. But apart from being addressed to the wine jar, it's also addressed to this old friend of Horace, it's being brought down in honor of Messala Corinthus, his friend, and not just any old friend. This guy was a very interesting man. He was a comrade at arms of Horace's at the Battle of Philippi. And it's absolutely fascinating, I think, that Horace time and again mentions this, alludes to this battle in which he fought on the losing side, the side of Brutus and Cassius, against the person who would become his sort of ultimate patron, Octavian, later the Emperor Augustus. But you might think that he would have sort of swept all that under the carpet as time went on and he got into the favor of Augustus. But no, he talks about it repeatedly. And this is an old comrade at arms, Messala Corinthus, an interesting man who became a consul, but seems to have been rather philosophical in nature, as the poem suggests, and didn't really like being a politician. You get the feeling he was rather maybe a serious sort of introverted man compared to Horace. This is just something I pick up from the way he talks. But someone who particularly benefited from a bit of wine to loosen up his loosen his inhibitions and get him talking and eventually dancing, apparently, or however literally we have to take that. So he's known Messala Corinthus for a long time, very old friend, and he's brought out this special bottle, and he's talking also, you know, about that. He's remembering this great Battle of Philippi. You know, he's remembering that that was what he believed in at that time. There's a lot going on there. The powers of wine, you know, to lubricate friendship, as I've said, to mellow these, perhaps someone who needs mellowing a bit, sort of unlock slightly sort of, you know, difficult ideas, or, you know, so there's that philosophical side. But I feel the climax of this poem actually is the line in the penultimate stanza or quatrain, "Tu spem reducis mentibus anxies." It's you bring back hope to anxious minds, and that's simple in a way for Horace. I mean, it's not difficult to understand, but it's very, very powerful, I think, and it's I find very moving that line, actually. I think and he's talking also very democratically, I think, about wine. You know, he also mentions the poor in the next line, that to the poor man, paupery. Now, why, you know, he does this time and again. He obviously had reached a level of great comfort as a result of being gifted this Sabine farm by Maecenas, living in great comfort, but he doesn't allow himself to be complacent, a sort of, you know, someone living in a life of luxury who forgets about those who don't live like that. He's always remembering the fact that people do not live like that, and that wine is a democratic instrument for him, although it is also an object of connoisseurship. It's also something that at its very basic level brings bringing hope. What could be more important than that, I feel? Well, at the end, he says, of course, it leads you into this sort of diviner realm, if you're very lucky. I mean, I'm not quite sure how many of us ever quite reach that point. Certainly not at London wine tastings. We don't get, Venus, unfortunately. But it's an incredibly beautiful poem, I think. And it's very overlooked by many experts. Amazingly, for me, the greatest sort of authority on Horace, greatest scholar, is Eduard Frankl. Funnily enough, this book, which it's a book of sort of incredible insight and authority, I think. And Frankl was also the son of a wine merchant, I discovered, like me. But very oddly, he doesn't mention Odes 321 at all in this book, although he does. There's a very good discussion of Vile Fortavis. He doesn't mention Odes 321, although I read somewhere else that he used to discuss it in seminars and was apparently spoke very movingly about it. So that's a mystery. Well, why didn't Frankl write about it? Well, I was going to talk about the last of these odes, Quo me Bacchae, but I think I'll maybe just read my translation, because this is a completely different kind of poem. This is a kind of wild dithyramb in which Horace has already kind of gone over to the wild side. He's allowed himself to be carried away by Bacchus, the wine god. So it's like following on from the end of that poem, Odes 321, where he talks about Bacchus. This time Bacchus is leading him off. So this is Quo me Bacchae, Odes 325. Where are you rushing me off to, wine god? I am being driven wild into the woods, into a troll's cave. I'm inspired. There's something absolutely fresh, which no one has ever written before, a new kind of poetry, the poetry of peace. I'm like a bacchant, one of your wild ones, silent upon a Greek peak, high above Hebron, looking out over a frozen landscape and the Rhodope, at the very bounds of civilization and beyond. Because I too like to stray off-piste into empty woods. O you who have power over river spirits and women who uproot trees with bare hands, full of you I will speak grand things. My words will soar, O Lord of the winepress, and they will not die. I am drinking deep, taking the risk, binding my brow with vine shoots. So we'll leave Horace there in this quite wild and exalted state as a follower of Bacchus. And much more could be said on this subject, but I feel I'd like to allow any of you who've been kindly listening or might want to ask or add anything. So I think I'll leave it there for the time being, John and Allegra, and let us go on to questions if that seems appropriate.
I think that's a great idea. So thank you very much, Harry. I'll ask the first question, and then if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there's a little reactions button. If you click that, there's a little spot for raise hand. If you would like to do that, I will try to get you basically in order. And I don't know, Harry, when you have to go, but basically the way we do things, sometimes the question and answer session can go longer, but I will at the hour mark definitely suggest to people if they want to go.
I'm okay for that. I'm okay, so should be fine. I'm relaxed at the moment, and my wife may come back and ask me to do something, in which case we might have to
if we've got more stuff to discuss, then we'll see. But yeah, great. So I'd like to ask a question first about just to go back to the first poem that you read in the Vile Fortavis. You talked about Horace's Pride, and one of the things that was his pride at just offering his thing, even though it wasn't particularly special, right? And then certain ways it has a value which is different from which is distinct from connoisseurship or market value, but because it's his. And I just wanted to ask kind of, I see so many people who seem to me to have lost some of the enchantment, right, with the world, right? And so when I see something like this, where Horace is talking about something that's personal and it's also local, right? It's not just McDonald's, right? It comes from a specific place. And it seems that he has the power to be enchanted by it, and maybe other people wouldn't, but he does, right? And that, it seems to me, is one of the things that in this very homogenized world, it's one of the things I'd most like to see recovered, right? That sense of the local, where individuals have pride, right? So again, I'm coming here from Steubenville, Ohio, and there's not much that Steubenville, Ohio makes or takes pride in right now. And so I just like to kind of with this, connect, Horace. I know you know a lot about the slow food movement and local food movement, and talk maybe a bit about that and how you think like classics maybe, or Horace, and maybe just Horace, I don't know, could be connected to that movement to sort of re-enchant the world through localism. So.
Yes, I mean, I quite agree. I mean, I am interested. I know the slow food movement, I suppose, is one of the, well, it's, I started writing this column, Slow Lane, in 2004. I can't quite remember the sequence of events, but I felt a strong kinship with the slow food movement, and I've sort of followed that to some extent. I've met Carlo Petrini, the founder, more than once, and I'm very sympathetic with that whole idea. And also, I'm pleased that not over the time since then, I feel, well, just where we are in London, we have a farmers market locally that has become it seems to go from strength to strength. I mean, there are a lot of farmers markets now operating in London, where the food comes from within 100 miles of London, but so it's not that local, but it's relatively local. And I think that it is something to me, I think, that's powerful. I mean, some may say, well, that isn't going to solve the problem of mass, food, but I think that that's perhaps not quite right. I think that if, it turns out, I think we can grow food far more than we think, even in cities. This is actually, in America, I think there's some very good things have happened within cities in connection with slow food in Chicago, I believe, and other big cities, and in London too. And there's quite a lot of beekeepers in London, actually. And in some ways, actually, the bees do better in London because there's more variety of plants and flowers in London, including all the gardens in London, than there is in many parts of the countryside, which are pretty much a desert because of intensive agriculture. I mean, I think this is important, actually. And I mean, Horace, he's quite, this is where he can be quite subversive in his subtle way, So although he sort of acknowledges these grand crus, numerous times, as is Falernian, and those famous Caecuban and these other recognized, these were as the sort of top wines of Italy at that time. But he's very proud of his Vile Sabinum, and you get the feeling he took personal care and pride, and I think that's a sign of that can be extended. That people can take care and trouble over local production of many things, and we can indeed grow things, and something almost we've forgotten how to do because we got so used to having all that done for us by big corporations, or and I mean, I feel that is something that he actually could be an inspiration for, or is an inspiration for. Yes, I think you've gone. Can't hear you, John.
I'm unmuted, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's great. So, Diana, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Harry, thank you so much. I can't tell you how excited I am. I'm a high school teacher, and while I completely agree that Horace really is a poet for the middle-aged, I do find that teenagers can find him quote unquote relatable if you pick and choose the right poems. And thank you for introducing me to the poems in book 3. I really was not familiar with them. I am too a fellow wine lover, and I guess one of the questions I had was, could you suggest poems that for you have really illustrated friendship up maybe apart from Maecenas, because the class I will be starting with Horace has just finished some letters of Seneca about friendship. So I was really happy to hear you mention that. And we're reading Cicero about friendship, and a natural stepping stone from those philosophical works would be Horace and Epicureanism and so on. So if you could suggest a poem or two that you think would be accessible to teenagers, that would be great. And I guess I would just add that I find what's so amazing about Horace is the artistry. And for me, poem 138, I think it is, where he manages to fuse life, vita, and the grape, vitis, and ours, and the grape bower, and just simplicity, and you really...
You mean the Persicus Ode for, yeah, the very short but incredible poem. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I love
and
that.
Just thank you for reminding me and us about all these great interlocked themes. But if you could just mention something about friendship, that would help me.
I might need to sort of go back to obviously the Odes 321, I think is a great example addressed, because that's addressed to someone we know quite a bit about, Messala Corinthus, because he was an interesting man, and he was a close friend of Horace, obviously. I'd have to think more about that to give you, but there are other poems we don't really know who the addressee was exactly. So the posthum, Ehu Fugaces, posthume, who was Posthumus, or maybe he didn't really exist. I don't know, but he may have done. It has a friendly tone. I think it's true that Maecenas does rather dominate, because obviously he was so important in Horace's life, and that relationship was so, it was complex and central and deep, and indeed, we were told, that Maecenas, when he died, said to Augustus, look after Horace as if he was me, but Horace only outlived him by, I think it was 59 days. So it was rather extraordinary that he didn't actually live, and almost as if he couldn't live, without Maecenas. But something I talk about in relation to that is the idea of therapy or therapeutic sort of friendship, because it seems to me, I talk a lot about this in the book, that maybe not that many commentators have sort of pointed out, or that Horace is so often seeming to try to lift Maecenas' mood. We have it from other Roman sources that Maecenas was prone to melancholy and hypochondria. We might say was a depressive in our terms, someone who really suffered from that. And Horace seems to be often trying to lift his mood, and not in a crude way, but in a quite profound way. So that's a kind of friendship. But in terms of other friends, yes, we were not in touch, but let me think about that. There are many poems that are addressed to people who seem to be friends, but we don't seem to know exactly who they were. That's slightly frustrating. But
what about the poems with Virgil?
Oh, well, actually, yes, of course, I could say something about that. Yes, clearly he was. Virgil, that is a very fascinating friendship, and also that's very profound. Yes, I think that in one poem, I've written about this elsewhere, but he seems to be almost taking Virgil to task for weeping too much. You probably know the poem I mean, and there's. But in a very friendly kind of way, and obviously there's bringing out the difference between them. That Virgil was tremendously important to Horace, because he was the guy who introduced him to Maecenas, and obviously there's immense mutual respect there, I think, and a deep friendship. So that's very true. Apart from in those Odes, he also comes in that satire when they're going on this traveling the length of Italy, and there's all this embracing that goes on, and this is one of the satires. So yes, yes, of course, that's another very close friendship. I know Horace was obviously was a man who had many friends and sort of rejoiced in friendship, I think. But in terms of the poems, well, of course, there are also epistles addressed to people. We don't necessarily know that much about who they were, but yeah, it's a pity we don't know more, perhaps, in some cases.
Yeah, I don't want to pin you on this yet, but I'm thinking, what is that poem that you mentioned where he says to Virgil to like toughen up, or these are the conditions of life.
Yes, I could find it, but I won't try and
in
find
the
it
book,
now. But
everyone,
funny enough, I gave an address to the Virgil Society in London about that, about the relationship between, because they asked me to talk, and I thought the best thing to do was talk about the relationship between Horace and Virgil. It's really fascinating. Of course, also in the sense that it may be that Horace was also slightly, what did he really think about the Aeneid, and indeed, what did Virgil? Because Virgil asked for it to be destroyed, as you know. But this was not the sort of thing Horace would have written. Horace wasn't a great believer in epic. So, I wonder what went on between them about that. I wonder that, Horace sort of absolutely wasn't really in favor of writing epics, but his great friend did write this great epic. Then he asked for it to be destroyed. Unfortunately, it wasn't. So that would be a very interesting novel or something. If someone had the ability to write a historical novel, I think that would be really fascinating. There is a book called The Death of Virgil, isn't it? I've never read it.
Yeah, it's not. It's pretty tough reading.
Tough reading.
Yeah, but so I wrote down this thing. It's Horace and Virgil's "O quiam plexus et gaudia quanta fuere." It's him meeting Virgil and Sinuessa. And one of the things that's great about this book is you do talk about going to these places like Venosa, like Horace's villa at Licenza. One of the ones I don't think you visited was Sinuessa, which is where that supposedly took place. It is the filthiest, most disgusting beach in all of Italy, and it really is like I went there and there were like piles of like used diapers like all around and all this stuff. It was just like, it was really it's one of those spots where it's like, okay, the magic is kind of gone a bit, but Sinuessa, you can almost go there because it's so bad, but it's that bad. But anyway, like broken glass on the beach and things like that. But anyway, so
well, it's a bit like that when you go on the train. If you go to Herculaneum and Pompeii, that's quite depressing. And
yeah, the Circumvesuviana.
There's a lot of pretty depressing kind of little areas you go through. And even going down towards Herculaneum is a pretty sort of uninspiring stretch of sort of knick-knack shops and so on. But then, well, that's the reality. There we are. Yeah, well, when I was in Naples researching Horace, there was a refuse collectors strike, which I think has been going on for decades, actually. So probably when I say there was one, it never ends. But so I know what you mean. But I still love Naples in its way. Yeah.
Beatrice or Beatrice? I'm not so.
Yeah, Beatrice is great, but named after Beatrice. Yeah, so both accurate. Hello, I'm a high school teacher in New England, and I wanted to say, of course, thank you, Harry, that this is so enriching and wonderful to be introduced to other poems and this wonderful concept, and to think more about wine. And thank you, Diana, for mentioning that high school students can love Horace. This is my Horace unit in the fourth year is the highlight that they always come back to when they're doing individual research as seniors. They always come back to these themes and they're just fascinated by him. I think partly because, certainly we can all access the carpe diem and all of these connections with nature, seasons, human life, wine, right? Youth, all of this, we do Thaliarchus, right? And this lovely scene of flirtation, they can relate to that and they understand that. And we do para, right? they love that one. What was I about to say? I just lost my train of thought, sorry. So Horace can move teenagers as well, right? As we adults, although I feel like from our perspective at middle age and above, he really touches us deeply, and we are grateful for him. And I would love to explore your book, and I enjoyed your translations very much, the way that you capture the spirit of the Latin, bring it into the modern day, give it a little bit of a spin that can capture his sense of humor and what he's trying to say, but in a way that relates to us. I think the kids would enjoy that as well. I often have to find a book prize for the end of the year, so I'm going to check yours out and keep that in mind. And I was thinking also, I so enjoyed you taking us through 321, which I had not read before, and that wonderful line that I think you so accurately honed in on about hope, right? Wine, you give hope to anxious minds. This strikes at the heart, I think, of Epicureanism, right? This is like wine is the access point for ataraxia. That's what we want, right? Is hope and calm for our anxious minds. And you mentioned philosophy, so I thought that was a lovely thing to focus on. I also was reflecting on that great last stanza. And you were saying we are brought up to the gods. I know Horace is a funny guy, and I think he's also saying the gods get brought down to our level, right? They're the graces taking off their girdle. He's always joking about the graces, right? Like in 4:7, they dare to go outside, nuda, right? And then in here they're like, whoa, they're tipsy and they're starting to get a little relaxed, right? So I mean that too. There's so much multidimensionality in him. Oh, and now I remember.
That's a very good. I love your point about bringing the gods coming down to earth rather than us going up to heaven.
They're having a wine party. They're having a conversatio themselves.
It's a great point.
And now I remembered what I had lost before, which is Nietzsche. I don't have the exact quote in mind, but Nietzsche talks about Horace's writing as a mosaic, right? As tesserae. His words are like tesserae, and
yes, I think that comes in my book somewhere. Yeah, it's a great quote. Each word connects in different directions,
and this graphic word order that Horace is a master of, I think, is another thing that can make him really accessible to the students. They are fascinated by his use of enjambment, by the way that he creates an actual picture in the words of what he's talking about, right? And 4:7 is another fantastic example where that happens, with the speed with which the seasons are dashing through, trampling one another. He's so clever and three-dimensional, and I think if we can, I prefer to focus in on fewer poems and really bring out that depth for them. But I
said at one point I saw him as possibly being like a cubist, seeing things from different perspectives. Some of which it was sort of reflected in the not the American cover of my book, but the British cover. Has a slightly it's a sort of Liechtenstein-y cubist look.
Yes, I love that.
What you were saying made me remember that. But I think it's a good, instead of being difficult, which it is difficult initially to just understand what's going on because of the word order is obviously it's not at all like English word order in many. But of course, that's for him. That's a great advantage because with a inflected Latin language like Latin, you can play around with the word order so creatively. Yeah.
Yes, and I think with Horace we get the finest examples of that. I mean, Virgil, of course, is magnificent too in that. But I think the students, it really sticks with them, and they appreciate what Latin poetry can do that English can't. So thank you for this added dimension and a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Very cool. So we're just about at the hour mark, but can we get Mark's question in, and that way everyone's got a hand up as had a chance.
Okay. Thank you. And Harry, thank you very much for your talk. And I'd like to thank Beatrice because my question sort of, I hope, nicely follows along from what she said. One of the things that's always puzzled me in Horace is why Epicurean would talk so much about the gods. And you think of his connection to the countryside, and for a Roman, like the agriculture and viticulture and being in woods they're very sensitive to that numinous feeling. And my question is just, what do you have a sense, or did you what's your take on his constant referencing to the gods? And if I could just say one more thing in terms of the ode in 4:7, where Diana cannot help Hippolytus out of the underworld because they're all we're nothing but dust as mortals. And there's an interesting contrast with the way that story is told in the Aeneid, where Diana does help Hippolytus out of the underworld. So now you've given me inspiration to imagine Virgil and Horace drinking wine late into the evening and arguing over that particular story.
Right, that's a lovely idea. But no, I certainly could say quite a bit about what I thought a lot about Horace and the gods and why he constantly references the gods. And also, I would also say to say he's an Epicurean is only, in my view, is only partly true. I mean, he was more of an Epicurean probably than anything else, but he wasn't really in anything, in my view. He was he sort of picked and chose rather what he believed in, I feel, and he could be a bit of a Stoic, as we know, in like something like the Regulus Ode. That's Stoic, isn't it? I mean, so I don't know that he was. I mean, he was obviously much more of an Epicurean than anything else. But on the other hand, he constantly talks about the gods. For example, his relationship to Mercury, the god Mercury, his patron god. I mean, this isn't just a way of speak. This isn't just like a light way of speaking, or he really feels it, I think. So in some way, I think the gods are very important to him. Perhaps, if you're familiar with Jungian psychology at all, I mean, that might be a helpful way of thinking about it. And or a writer like James Hillman, who very much would like us to return to a kind of polytheism, which I think would be rather like, well, I mean, perhaps it's stretching it too far, but I think there's something of that going on. It's not unserious for Horace the way he talks about the gods, but it's also not particularly solemn either, and I particularly like the way he talks about Mercury, because Mercury is a sort of playful, as you know, is the most playful and the trickster and the guy who plays tricks on people. But is also the communicator and the sort of medium. And Mercury was the god who kept him safe, when he escaped from Philippi, according to Horace, whatever actually happened. And so, yes, I think it's a fascinating subject, and it's not to be taken lightly. And I'd say when he talks about Bacchus, I mean, Quo me Bacche is a serious poem. I mean, it's not a light poem. So I think he's difficult to pin down, as always, actually. But I find it very moving the way he talks about those things, and also, as you say about the local things with the Romans. I mean, they also, of course, believed there were spirits in everything. That every stream or wood, perhaps had a kind of god. And so when he talks about the Fons Bandusii, I mean, and that's extremely, to me, moving. And it's not, the Fons Bandusii is a sort of place for the spirit, so that's a kind of partial answer. A very interesting question.
Yes, thank you. And wine makes a nice bridge between the two. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, and Mark, I'll just mention that that a lot of these questions are dealt with at very pleasing length in the book. So because Harry writes about how for Horace, you can't just put him in a box, and there's a lot of us who feel that way now today. It's one of the things that makes him feel very modern, is that his religion isn't easily, you can't just put a label on him and walk away and say he's Epicurean, and so therefore doesn't have any notion of anything other than material. Right, it's all just atoms. He's not. You can't put him in there. On the other hand, does he really think that if you sacrifice a hecatomb, it's going to really affect what happens. You know, that also doesn't seem to be part of the way he thinks either. And so
All right.
this is, and Harry talks about, you know, puts us in a modern context.
And as well as his relationship with Virgil, who obviously was a friend of his, you know, there's also his relationship with Lucretius, you know, who Lucretius really was an Epicurean, you know, but somewhat dogmatic, perhaps, although a great and amazing a sort of poet. But I think Horace is extremely different from someone like Lucretius. So that's quite interesting too.
Yeah. So one, I'd just like to follow up on that a little bit. So, what do you think? So having spent all this time with Horace, and the fact that we can through wine, you left us with that last poem where it really is ecstatic, right? It's this like breakthrough state. It's mystic, and it is part of what we need to be able to access that more, right? Is that, I mean, again, I returned to this modern problem of disenchantment, and in wine as this gateway, right? And it seems like there is something through the gates, right? And we need to be there a bit more often in order to love our lives. And that's one of the big takeaways that I had from the book. Is wanted to see if you had further things to say about
it. Very good point, John. Yes, this might I might have to make this the last comment, but I think that's yes, I feel that's an open question, perhaps for all of us, because I mean, you know, that's quite challenging. We live in a pretty kind of scientific, rational world now, don't we? And we're also constantly being admonished about our consumption of alcohol. And indeed, even I get admonished about my consumption of alcohol in this house. So going through that, I mean, but the threshold we're talking about doesn't just involve getting sort of drunk in a crude way, obviously. But it involves reaching that. It's a sort of liminal. I say that wine and poetry are both liminal things in the book. They're things sort of on the threshold, and that they're sort of somewhere they're on that threshold. I think it's good to be aware that there is that threshold, and we don't quite know what is beyond it. I think maybe Horace is a bit like that, and we're aware of it. In this, as you say, what makes him quite relevant or modern is that perhaps we feel like that in this sort of world, that we think there is something beyond, you know, scientific materialism, which is the sort of world we sort of inherited from the 19th century, really. But and obviously, writers from Nietzsche onwards have been questioning this. That kind of destroyed our sense of wonder in the world. And that's I mean, with the benefit of giving us longer lives and sort of, you know, clean water and health and so on, but destroying our enchantment in the world is a pretty heavy price to pay. You know, so how can we get that wonder and enchantment back without sort of succumbing to you know, perhaps, you know, beliefs that none, you know, that others of us would not endorse, you know, or could lead us in other directions. And that's a fascinating question, right, isn't it? But I think poetry and wine can take us to somewhere else. You know, they can take us outside our normal bounds, and I think that's something they can both do. Although where exactly they take us, well. Perhaps that's for each of us to find out, you know, and see how far we can go. I mean, Horace is definitely sort of saying in that poem that he's gone somewhere beyond the bounds, it's the normal bounds. And I think he's talking about the kind of poetry that he's writing actually in book 3, and that's one of the things he's talking about. But also not just that, I think. So almost beyond the bounds of civilization. But without succumbing to, I don't know, whatever you might call it, sort of primitivism or something that we wouldn't want to, or indeed something worse, you know, some terrible political disaster. You know, it's very challenging. But I think he has a very subtle way of acknowledging that there is something beyond all, you know, all this materialism, and that we should be aware of it, and that we should continue to drink wine. And it may take us to some pretty magical places. And who knows, that those gods may come down to earth and be with us in a benign kind of way, which is what happens at the end of 321, if we're lucky.
Yes, Barry, I see that nice nice little line there. Yeah, they also in it's Italian, they have just the phrase spirito divino, right, which is the divine spirit and the spirit of wine. And it's nice. Yeah, well,
And
so
by the way, Ortega y Gasset, you mentioned that it's actually a philosopher I'm very interested in. A great Spanish philosopher, mid-20th century, but he wrote a wonderful essay about this, in which he said, wine is not just an administrative problem, wine is a god.
yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah, and also with this, as Harry said, and it comes throughout the book. Poetry is a dry form of this, right? I mean, so without the administrative problems, without at least so many administrative problems, and that it's possible to reach that that state of this intoxication, in this enchantment sense, through art itself, and that's and the fact that Horace brings those two together and puts them in the same place to make the point, is an important theme. It's the master theme of the book.
Yes, I quite agree, and I think that's where I'm taken with this. And I think the more time we spend with poetry, and Horace being at the very summit of poetry, in my view, I don't think there's anything much better than that. There are many other great poets, but he's one of the greatest of all of them. The more time we spend with that, the better for all of us.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say that's our little perfect little send off there. So one of the reasons why I took an interest in this is that Paideia is doing a Horace program this summer. So 2 weeks of reading Horace in Italy in these spots, and that's an Allegra that is there with the link there, and so as I've been looking to engage more with Horace. We all are at the Institute, and so that's how I came across your book, Harry. And it's just like one of the things that's amazing. I think all of us have this experience. Is why we're here. At times we have this experience either with our books or in our classrooms, right, of breaking through in this way into something that seems bigger and divine, right, dare I say, and that and a lot of times we've also had them in Italy, right, which is so to do both at the same time, and also and have wine as well, is one of the great pleasures of life. So anyway, that's something that's happening this summer, but I encourage all of you to pick up Harry's book again. If you're looking for a way to get back into Horace, like, this is a book you can he talks about going around with his red lobe, and you can just have your little stack of lobes too, and when he quotes something, you can just go right to right there. It is. That's the book you read about. Yeah,
falling apart. It's almost reached the end of its life, but it's
that's great. That's nothing quite like a well-used book, but anyway, so this is a great way to enter into these things, and then, like, reading your translations, Harry, you then can go back to the Latin, and yes, they are free, but again, it pushes you to think about what Horace is really saying and what the big ideas are and how to get them to our students now. So it's great stuff, and so I thank all of you for coming. And a big round of applause to our speaker, Harry Eyres.